我唱一个首歌吧。我们的田野，美丽的田野，沥沥的河水流过无边的稻田。
That's young Arabella Kushner, the granddaughter of President Trump, and a video presented by President Trump to Chinese President Xi. And what was interesting, of course, Arabella singing in Mandarin, but referring to the first couple of China as Grandpa Xi and Grandma Peng, which through a child's eyes, without all the geopolitical and social implications, I'm sure Arabella, who's a young girl, I'm not being critical of her, but I'm wondering, in the name of diplomacy, are we sending the wrong message to the Chinese, and by nature, not to Arabella specifically, but by those in her generation, which will be Generation Z, or maybe even the generation after that, what will be their outlook on the world? All of this came to mind. You and I talked briefly about this poll the other day, but our friends at campusreform.org have given it the prominence it really deserves. The headline, Poll, Millennials Would Prefer to Live in a Socialist Country. The byline belongs to the investigative reporter for campusreform.org, a young man named Nikita Vladimirov. And Nikita joins us now from the studio provided for Campus Reform at the Leadership Institute just across the river from the District of Columbia. Nikita, we appreciate your time this morning on Newsmax TV. What was most surprising to you about this poll of American millennials?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on. Second of all, to answer your question, alongside the title that you mentioned, that most millennials do prefer to live in a socialist country, there were a number of very shocking statistics in this study. For example, 7 out of 10 Americans could not properly define communism. Half of millennials, according to the same study, could not define capitalism. So this just underscores the scope of the problem. And there were a number of very interesting findings. I have a whole stack of them here that I can just keep reading on to you. But this just underscores the scope of the problem and underscores also how socialism has become much more popular among millennials and unfortunately among Americans as a whole. Very dangerous tendencies.
Well, Nikita, obviously we see your name and we assume that your parents came from an area which we used to call behind the Iron Curtain. So you have come to this country. And no doubt you heard about the horrors of communism firsthand, and your parents got the heck out of there. And you know, we hear this with any number of Eastern European immigrants. I heard this years ago when they said, you know, what Obama is ushering in is what we were trying to leave in terms of involvement of the state in every facet of our lives. And some people think that's over-dramatized. Meantime, you have kids being educated in public schools where, you know, and some people thought this was a grand plan of the Russians. I'm not so sure it, or the old Soviets. I'm not so sure it's that as much as it is a kind of laziness and just allowing the left to take over the education apparatus. Whatever has happened, has education been replaced with indoctrination, or is it just simple laziness on the part of American teachers and students?
I think the answer contains two parts. On the one side, you do have the academia, which is extremely Marxist. Many departments openly embrace Marxism. For example, as we reported at the Leadership Institute's Campus Reform, earlier in the summer, there was a Socialism 2017 conference, annual conference, had over 1,500 people in attendance, many of whom were professors, students, and activists. So that just shows you the scope of the movement. Now, on the other hand, you do have the political aspect of this. As you mentioned, you had President Obama, who continuously told business owners that, hey, by the way, you didn't build that business, somebody else built that business for you. A very Russian type of Lenin-esque mentality. And of course, you have Senator Bernie Sanders, who is now the idol of the progressive movement, who, according to some recent reports, depending on whether or not you believe them, was almost the candidate to represent the entire Democratic Party against against Donald Trump in the November presidential election. What a scary thought that is. You know, and actually, my parents came here with me. I was about 10 or 11 years old when I came to the United States, and I never thought when my airplane landed at the Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston, Texas, that socialism would greet me so shamelessly at the terminal.
Let's talk attitudes and indoctrination are one thing within the academy and within education. And certainly in higher education it is there, but it would appear now that in public schools it is becoming all too commonplace as well. But I'm curious as to what happens to people. You know, it used to be, now granted, I went to college back in the Stone Age. I've kind of grown up now, and more years than I'd care to count. But the joke used to be overtones of Churchill: if you're young and not liberal, you have no heart. And if you get older, if you do not grow more conservative, then you have no mind. You know, that whole thinking. The way we used to say it is, man, a lot of my friends were liberals until they got their first paycheck and they saw all the government was taking in terms of withholding in the paycheck. Mm-hmm. Is there any promising sign when millennials reach the real world, or will this indoctrination that you say gave us more than a flirtation with Bernie Sanders on the national scene politically, is this a philosophy that stays in place regardless of what you and I might call the realities of the marketplace?
Right. Fantastic question. The latest political science research data that we've reported on suggests that Generation Z, which you've mentioned in your introduction, may actually be much more pro-free market. Now, one has to keep in mind that this is very early on. Generation Z is just now getting into college. Maybe they're 18 years old or so. So the research is at the very early stages. But at the same time, that's somewhat promising. As far as millennials are concerned, unfortunately, this is one of many polls, and I'm sure there are going to be many polls to come in the future that continuously underscore how progressive and how well, really, it's regressive. Everything that progressives stand for in this country has already been tried by my motherland. So to me, this is a step backwards. But nonetheless, everything has already been tried. And it shows repeatedly that this generation stands for those type of socialist principles. It's very unfortunate.
And of course, we used to hear that the Soviets would hold elections, and the turnout was almost 100%. But there was only one choice on the ballot. I mention that as a prelude, given your unique heritage. We just went through 8 years of Obama. And I think it's remarkable, the economic recovery we're seeing. But the Japanese, when they went through a rough spell, they called it the lost decade. I call this the lost generation economically. Will millennials stick with a Sanders-type socialism? Will we have to go through another 4 to 8 years of economic desolation for Generation Z and others to learn the lesson? We've got about a minute left in this segment, Vladimir.
Well, hopefully not. And it is really up to us, up to you and me, to hold universities accountable and to encourage them to actually educate students about economics, about history, and not about whiteness or white privilege. I mean, it is really sad that millennials now can tell you all about the various differences in dozens of different gender-neutral pronouns, but they cannot even define capitalism and distinguish it from socialism and communism. So this has to end, and it is really up to you and me.
And it's also up to us baby boomers to properly identify with whom we speak. Nikita Vladimirov. Nikita, I'd ask you to stay with us because I am very interested in your story personally, coming to the United States at a relatively early age, but an age of cognition where presumably you had to learn the English language and firsthand what it's like to be an American. Let's have you stay with us for the next segment, Nikita Vladimirov of Campus Reform. We'll talk about his personal experiences, how they relate to our headlines today, and we will do so in just mere moments. Speaking of headlines, Miranda Khan will be along with the news update, and then we will continue, so please stay tuned. And we are back on our Thursday program. Let's continue the conversation now with Nikita Vladimirov who is the investigative reporter for campusreform.org. Nikita, you brought us the story. We had touched on this poll last week, and it's shocking numbers. But for one who came to the United States to seek out freedom and free markets, and one, I guess, who was birthed in the crucible of communism, even though allegedly it was gone from the old Soviet Union, I'm just kind of curious in terms of your personal experience. When you came to the United States, did you speak English? Did you have to learn it here? And what has been the greatest lesson you have learned during your time living here in the United States?
Well, yes, I came to this country when I was about 12 years old. I actually didn't speak much English at all. I just knew the basics, how to ask somebody, where's the bathroom, kind of the elementary things that you need to know as a kid. So I've been speaking this language fluently for about 10 years now. I absolutely love America. I absolutely do. And a lot of what I envisioned America to be when I was in Russia came true. What I was most shocked and surprised about is how the mistakes of my motherland, that are actually the mistakes that are continuously being made today by Vladimir Putin and by many socialist policies that have outlived the collapse of the Soviet Union. I was shocked how those policies have gained traction politically here in America. That's the most shocking thing of all. I would have to say. And another thing that I noticed straight away when it comes to the education system, I was asked to take this standardized test, as I'm sure you're well familiar with. And one of the first questions, and I've never been asked this question before in my life, was, what is your ethnicity? And then it gave me a list of options: Black, Hispanic, white, Native American. And I thought to myself, how absurd. Why don't we just put other, circle other, and put American? And this is when I knew nothing about America, when I was in America for probably 2 or 3 weeks at that point. And my instinct was that this was just so perverse. And I think that contributes to the divisive politics that we see today, because the education system from the very beginning divides us into groups and into various enclaves.
Well, it's interesting you should mention that, because I'm sure as you subsequently studied American history, it was President Theodore Roosevelt who railed against hyphenated Americanism. Back really early in the 20th century, 100 years ago or more. He said, there's no such thing as hyphenated Americanism. It's American. And obviously, instinctively, you took that lesson up. With the minute that remains, Putin, what is his goal? To usher in a neo-Soviet Union? What do you think the goal is of your former home? About a minute remains.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. I wish I had more than a minute to answer it. But very briefly, Putin is very anti-American. His goal, his way and method of ruling is very much pro-foreign policy. Russia, ideologically, is not very radical today, though I do have to note that the Communist Party continuously comes in second in almost every single election. And we have policies that, as I mentioned, that outlived the collapse of the Soviet Union. The single-payer healthcare system is one of them, and many other totalitarian aspects of our government remain in place, and Putin does not seem to want to get rid of them that easily. So he does want to grip and maintain a very strong political influence in Russia, and that is a very scary thought for Russians.
And a thought that should give all of us concern. Nikita Vladimirov, who is the investigative reporter at campusreform.org. Nikita, we appreciate your time. We hope you will come back and visit with us again real soon. Now, when we continue, an interesting exchange on another network, as we might say it, involving former Democrat National Committee Chairman Donna Brazile. Stay tuned for that.